I'm a visual artist. I do a lot of printmaking, but I also make sculpture and drawings and video and a few other things, just at random. And I've been part of the community of, I guess, visual artists in Toronto with a few contacts with Open Studio over the years.
I'm an artist who's been based in Toronto since the early 90s, and my own work is based in video and installation and sculpture. But I've known about Open Studio the whole time, although I recently realized I hadn't actually been to the space till you moved into 401 Richmond in the 2000s.
I joined in 1993 at the encouragement of several of my colleagues from York University print shop or printmaking. One of them was working here, several were working as artists here, and they said, you've got to come, it's such a great community. I was a little intimidated because it had such an amazing reputation, and I was thinking maybe I wasn't good enough, but I was welcomed and encouraged and learned so much about printmaking and the different voices in printmaking, but also community. And I was really lucky to be here at that time. We had a studio over on King Street in Toronto, and it was like a rabbit warren of studio spaces. And I was positioned mostly in either intaglio or in screen print. And there I fell in love with printmaking. I was here all the time. I loved being here, and I worked on a lot of big projects.
In the 1990s, I came and I did just a single kind of artist project. It was amazing. I had such fun. After I was introduced to the studio, I was given a set of keys and I could come and go whenever I wanted, which I was kind of wondering if this was really true. And then I came one night at like midnight and stayed all night, and it was marvelous. So I did a really large dry point on the tabletop that I stole from the print studio at OCAD. I like recycling things, so I saw this beautiful table that was battered and covered in dents and scratches, and I just stole it because it was going to the garbage. And the studio had just acquired a really, really big etching press, like massive, bigger than anything that I had access to. So part of my project was that I wanted to do the biggest dry point. I think it was like a 4x8 sheet of plastic. And it took me a while. I also made a lot of noise because I was working with a Dremel, so I didn't want to bother other people. So I spent a lot of time in here by myself in the middle of the night. And one night I finished up exhausted and way too caffeinated and came out, and the light was just, dawn was just breaking. And I went to ride home on my bike and my bike was gone. It was tragic. So one thing I do remember about the old space on King Street was it didn't feel completely, like the neighborhood was still a bit sketchy, and then bikes would just disappear. It wasn't just me. But I loved working in the studio. It was really welcoming and really productive.
In the 90s, I just recently graduated with my undergraduate degree from York University, and I was very heavily involved in the art scene, both going out and looking at work, making work, and then also I helped found a couple of artist collectives, including the Sculptors Collective Nethermind, which is still ongoing. The art scene was, it was mainly focused on phototextual work and a lot of work about identity politics, but mainly about sexual orientation. That was it felt like the majority of the work that was being made, and partly the impetus for our Sculptors Collective, because we just didn't see sculpture being shown. And it was a fortuitous time in that the early 90s was a recession. And so, although that's bad for most people, I think that's often good for artists. And the upside for us was that there were lots and lots of large warehouse spaces that hadn't been condoized as they are now, that were available for rent. So we just had to coax owners and convince them that by renting to us, they would raise awareness about their space. So yeah, so we could have spaces up to 6,000 square feet. And you know, everything was still paper, like you printed an invite, you printed a poster. When a show started, you went along hoardings and put up hundreds of posters. And yeah, those kinds of things are extremely different from right now.
Hi, it was busy. There were a lot of really great exhibition spaces. Artists quite often got together and just rented a space, which was something that I did quite a bit of with friends. We had a few groups. I helped found Redhead Gallery, which was, you know, amazing. And we just started out at, I guess it was 80 Spadina, in this giant open space. There was nothing there. We got the phone lines, we built the walls, we organized the lighting, and started doing exhibitions. And I was a member for 10 or 12 years.
My generation that graduated from York University, we were just feeling like if there wasn't room for us at the table, then we would make a bigger table. There was an entrepreneurial spirit, and that changed everything. And it was part of that collective movement, which is how the House Project, Nether Mines, Farrago, there were so many interesting things that were going on at that time, which really shook up the whole community. And as it did Open Studio, suddenly there were projects like the House Project, which was a bigger installation project, but part of that initial portion of the project was a print portfolio, as the participants had all come from printmaking at York. But it was such an exciting time. It was an exciting time where it seemed like everything was possible. There was stuff going on in the 90s where, because of the recession, there was space, alternative spaces all over the city that were available either for free or for a low price. So suddenly you had big printmaking projects in old buildings. And they would be expansive projects where there might be prints, at the same time there might be an installation attached to it. So suddenly all these things were possible.
Oh, it was intense. It was beautiful, and also really educational for me, because I'm going through personal transition in my work and in my life, and I felt like reviewing that much artwork by other artists shook a few things loose for me. I felt like I was really seeing artwork that I had never seen before, which is always exciting, but I adore prints, so it was all prints, and it was like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet. Plus, yeah, Angela and Erica did such a great job bringing the prints out that it was effortless. We just kind of went, oh, look, more prints, you know, and then I became kind of intimidated and a little bit, I felt quite guilty for having to be so selective. I started asking myself those questions, like, would my work be able to stand up to this kind of scrutiny, and what have I taken away from this experience, the essence of trying to make a really interesting work of art using print. And for me, I really found that more and more I was drawn to the simple work, the work that had just like no extra frills or doodads or millions of layers, but just had this kind of purity and elegance. I don't know how to describe it. It's just an essence that made a really strong impression on me. So I started to revisit the ideas that I'm working on, and just a few small, you know, moments of insecurity and panic, but it was a good learning experience.
Going through the prints, it was very much like a memory palace, you know, where I would look at something and I would start to remember a story that would be associated, or an interaction I'd had with that particular artist. In some cases, I didn't know many of the people that were there, but then I would see these amazing projects that, again, Alan Ash would be sort of instilling in people, and he brought a lot of visiting artists. It was a different kind of program at that particular time. We were all, as well, on on committees. And so a lot of times I would see projects where I had supported or advocated for that artist that was now printing at Open Studio. And so going through those prints, it would remind me of, you know, those particular conversations. It was a community for me that there wasn't a lot of conflict. There was occasionally conflict, as there is with everywhere, but it was really one of camaraderie. And that was, again, looking through those prints would remind me, oh, that's when Lottie was doing that, or that's when, you know, Yael was doing that. I remember that printing, or I remember the struggle that someone was having with that. I remember the Isabel Hamard, you know, teaching me about lino cut, and you know, those kinds of things are triggered by looking at those prints that came out of that period.
Well, the interesting thing when we were reviewing the prints from the 90s was that I realized that all the artists I knew were artists that had an alternate or parallel practice in another medium. So I might have known their print work or not, but I knew them because they were also photographers, installation artists, painters, you know, so I knew that other medium and not necessarily their print work. So it was both a revisitation and an introduction to that side of their practice. So that was really exciting. And it was also interesting to kind of mentally track back and go, oh, you know, this friend of mine that we did our undergrad together, and you know, we're still connected, but there was this period where they were doing prints and I didn't actually know about it. Although I did realize that I have an original of one of the prints that was given to me. So that was very exciting.
Yeah, we took over a lot of weird spaces. As a group, I belonged to Persona Volare, which was a whole bunch of artists working in different media. And one amazing score that we got almost for free was an office space with half a dozen different empty offices. It looked like it could have been an architect's or something like that. And it was a bit beat down, and the electric system was really not great, but each person in the collective got their own office space to work with. The space itself was not legal for exhibiting, not legal for the public, not legal for selling beer, but we funded the entire operation with illegal beer sales and had a terrific turnout. The other artists, yeah, just, we had a blast. And I think now Toronto is a little bit harder to kind of do that ad hoc and in the moment kind of spaces, because they're very expensive and not as available as they were. So I think weird spaces that people wouldn't ordinarily use for making art or for exhibiting art, and also just that collective spirit of gathering together as a group and doing you know, projects that didn't cost a lot of money and were all our own labor made it happen. So more recently that is starting to come back, I think, and I see a lot of signs of life in the community. People are setting up their own exhibition spaces in their homes or other weird places, and I think, yeah, there's definitely a revival of that DIY energy.
What I loved about working at Open Studio, and I was part of both locations on King Street, sort of the Rabbit Warren studio, which was the first, and where I was able to facilitate a big community project. I was part of a project called the House Project, and one of the things that we did was we created a portfolio, and Open Studio welcomed us to come and print here, create the prints for the studio. And that was a wonderful extension of a project that we did. And then we sort of fast forward a couple of years and we moved down the street to a luxurious space on King Street where everything was sort of, unlike the Rabbit Warren, we now had all this open space. But one of the nicest parts of that second King Street location was there was a central kitchen sitting room. And at around 4 o'clock, Brian Hoxa would make coffee or tea. And we would all go in there and we would sit around and chat and share information technically, or just share jokes and laugh and giggle. Julie Voice was a big part of that group. Irina Shostakovich, Lottie Thomas. There were so many artists. And what I loved too about Open Studio was that it was age positive. So you could be 20 and be next to someone who was in their 70s and still feel part of a broader community.
One of my very first shows after undergrad with a group of 4 peers was actually here in 401 Richmond long before it became an art center. And we were, I think, the very first show, and it was part of a Roundup, which was this tour of artist studios throughout the city, but very quickly grew beyond that, and artists started banding together to rent or acquire spaces and show their work that way. So that is always interesting when I come back in this building. But the most spectacular space was off a courtyard just south of Queen and Dufferin. I think it's now a prop shop, and it had been a dyeing factory. It was 6,000 square feet, 20-foot ceilings at least. And the dyeing factory meant there were all these kind of coves in the floor, I guess where the dye had run down. And it was just a spectacular space. And I ended up lining one of these crevices with fluorescent orange chalk and then suspending these orange pylons with bright orange thread. So that was another Mind show. I think probably 1994 would be my guess. But that was the most spectacular space.
So one of the great things about Open Studio was, as I said, the community. And the community was always fundraising to support the studio. One of its biggest projects at the time was 100 prints. Alan Ash invited me as his guest to go to 100 prints, and I was incredibly excited. But of course I didn't have the money at the time to buy a print or anything like that. But there I was, and it was this incredible feast that had been prepared by all the artists, and it was amazing. And it was in an empty building over on King Street that had been renovated for office building, but it had been renovated out of an old building. So it was just a gorgeous building. And there are all these prints, and I'm looking at them and I'm going, and then all of a sudden I come across a Susan Schall print and my heart flutters. And I'm thinking, oh, I love this print. It was so beautiful. It was like pattern and decoration movement meet minimalism. And I just thought it was the most amazing thing. And then at 100 prints, they pull a number and you go and select a print. And I thought, oh, it'll be the first to go. But it wasn't. It was almost the last to go. People would go and they would take prints that I thought were, who would want that? And then all of a sudden I realized, this is all about what you love. It isn't about whether it is the best work or the most, it's about you look at that print and it tells you a story. It triggers you, triggers a story for you. Just as the Susan Schall print had triggered in me a whole lot of emotion. That's what was happening to everybody as they picked prints when their number was called at 100 prints.
Well, the really exciting find for me was a series of prints by Jean Bridge. And they are kind of dense images of thickets or bushes, but bare branches, really kind of dense and three-dimensional, and then very subtly colored, so they almost look like hand-painted photos from the early 20th century. And yet, they really resonated with me, partly because right now I'm really interested in ideas of entanglement and how trees communicate. and they go right up to the edge of the paper, so they felt really, really contemporary and like they hadn't aged at all. And I have to admit, this artist was a complete discovery for me.
I thought a lot about clothes, and which is not usually my priority, as you can tell. But my sister is a fashion designer, so it is something I notice. And there were a lot of works with clothing, like Jeannie Thib. I remember it wasn't part of the collection that we looked at, but I was riffing off of some of her draperies and handkerchiefs and clothing items. And there were two that really stood out for me, and I'm not exactly sure why, but it was a set of 2 gloves by Lisa Levitt. And afterwards I thought, I wish I'd taken a picture of that, and I have to remember to do that, because they are the kind of thing that I'm attracted to also in my work, which are ordinary objects that are ubiquitous, that are unnoticed, that are kind of just behind the scenes. And as printmakers, we do have to protect ourselves constantly with, gloves and a respirator and goggles and so on. And I've worked on my own themes of what we use as human beings to protect ourselves in various jobs, including, armor if you're jousting, and coat of mail, and things that go back into history. But those gloves stayed with me because they're so human and they're so yellow. They're very yellow. So yeah, I would say that it's a set of 2 prints. Not so much. It was different than I expected, and I'm still trying to analyze that. But it was really very feminine, which interested me, because I felt like there would be more politics and there would be more, I guess, male printmakers, and maybe in the work that was created by women, it would be a little bit more activist and political and feminist, but it was very gentle work.
So one of the things that I noticed when I was going through the, what I'm referring to as the memory palace of the 1990s, was that there was a lot of work that had that traditional stamp to it. And that's not what was going on outside of Open Studio. And I was very much part of both worlds. I was showing big work. I was using printmaking as an opportunity to create these large works. So I was so excited when Alan Ash would invite people from that part of the 90s, where at that expansive part, to come to Open Studio to kind of shake things up a bit. Because I think that there had been much work, particularly at the beginning, that was limited by the materials and limited by the challenges of printmaking. And what was happening outside is that all those things within printmaking, within other disciplines as well, people were saying there are no rules. And I was lucky enough that those were the kinds of conversations we would have at Open Studio. And so it was part of that evolution where we were going from that traditional printmaking, the rigidity sometimes and tradition of printmaking, and expanding that and saying, well, what would happen if I use this in this way? And that happened particularly near the end of the 90s, where I felt like we were, Open Studio was attracting people to its projects and to the studio that were more entrepreneurial, more who were excited about exploring the medium beyond its what could be perceived as its limitations or its history.
In the course of reviewing the prints, the thing I became aware of was the fact that, at that time at least, printmakers kind of often existed in their own world that was a little bit separate from at least my awareness of the art world. And so those artists that had practices that crossed over and into other media were the ones that I kind of knew about. But there was this separation that was even evident in the type of work that we were looking at. and that it didn't always represent the kind of broad trends that were really dominant in the Toronto art world at the time.
Felt like I started to be able, after this sort of overwhelming first day, the second and the third day I started to be able to really just look more precisely and find these works that really stood out and that moved me and made me inspired, made me feel inspired in my own work.